Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of the Congo have signed a declaration of principles under U.S. mediation, setting the stage for a possible peace agreement.
Secretary Rubio is signing as a witness the declaration of principles between the government of the Democratic Republic of the Congo and the government of the Republic of Rwanda. This declaration commits the parties to mutual recognition of sovereignty and territorial integrity, addressing security concerns, promoting regional economic integration, facilitating the return of displaced persons, supporting MONUSCO, and drafting a peace agreement. These are serious commitments from each side. The Secretary's presence here today as a witness signifies the importance the United States places on resolving this conflict to ensure both countries and their people prosper. We're looking forward to working with both sides to further our existing partnerships and foster win-win outcomes for all.
Well, joining us in the NSN studio is Bram Verelst, a senior researcher at the Institute for Security Studies, to discuss whether this is a game changer and what the motives of the parties are. Hi, Bram. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Do you think this agreement marks real progress, or is it just another diplomatic gesture?
It does mark some progress. It has been since mid-December that talks between the DRC and Rwanda have stalled, and that this was happening at that time under the Luanda process, which was an Angola-led mediation between looking to ease tension between both countries. And since then, actually, we haven't not really seen any direct bilateral engagement besides a brief meeting in Doha, in Qatar, in March, when the presidents surprisingly met there. So the fact that these two ministers went to Washington and signed this declaration, it is a progress compared to what we have seen the last months, but still needs a lot needs to happen, and so the situation remains very fragile, I would say, on a diplomatic level.
So there's a deadline quite soon, on the 2nd of May. Is it going to reach any agreement by then, or what should happen by then?
So the signing was indeed a declaration of principles, which is not a peace agreement. It's just a number of issues that they discuss. And in this declaration of principles, they mentioned that by the 2nd of May, so that's Friday, a draft of a peace agreement should be ready. And so that still leaves open what will be presented on Friday. It's also still a bit unclear if they will reach that deadline, because often in those processes there's a deadline set, but it can be also maybe pushed over the weekend depending on how negotiations go. From latest reporting, we've seen that there are actually delegations at this point in Qatar. There is US presence expected, as well as France, Togolese presence, because Togo also is AU, has this EU mandate being given, as a follow-up of the Luanda process. And so the delegations are 23 in the DRC government who are there. So it looks like they are negotiating a more comprehensive deal, or looking at a more comprehensive agreement where they would include a component between the DRC and Rwanda, this bilateral aspect, as well as M23 in this. But we don't know how this is going, and it might be that they would not reach the Friday deadline. So it remains quite unclear what can be expected from this draft agreement. What we can, given prior U.S. engagement, because it's not the first time that the U.S. was involved in this conflict, and given the bilateral aspect of the Declaration of Principles, we can expect that it would somehow take off where the Luanda process had stalled. Because the Luanda process, which kind of collapsed mid-December, was focused on the neutralization of the FDLR, which is a Rwandan armed group that has its roots in the genocide of 1994, in exchange for the lifting of Rwandan defensive measures, which basically means the withdrawal of Rwandan troops. And there was an agreement at ministerial level at that point, but eventually the real signing of the agreement with the presidents did not go through because Rwanda had included a third component, which was a direct dialogue between the Congolese government and M23 within the framework of this process, which the DRC government at that point refused. But since that there are talks now in Qatar between M23 and the Congolese government, this argument is on the table. So we might see this architecture that was discussed and negotiated under the Rwanda process now being taken over under this US supported mediation process.
Well, how central is US mediation? Are economic incentives, minerals, driving the deal?
It's a good question. I think it has two components. So on the first part, we do see some continuity because actually there is of course a new Trump administration, and we are seeing these major shifts in US policy. But when it comes to this conflict and its resurgence since end of 2021, US has involved directly in the past. It has installed confidence building measures. That was end of 2023, if I recall correctly. It has provided support to the Rwanda process. It has been involved through a kind of intelligence-led diplomacy, where actually they supported these bilateral negotiations before. So in that sense, this declaration of principles is also of sort of continuity from these prior US engagements. But indeed, the context in which this happens is also different. The United States is negotiating a minerals deal with the DRC and apparently also with Rwanda at the same time. So there are these economic incentives that drive the US engagement, in particular the kind of geopolitical context around critical minerals, but also possible incentives for the DRC and Rwanda itself on US investment. And so some have said that this confidence, that the declaration of principles is actually a confidence building measure for investors first, to create a climate for US investment. And it's within the declaration of principles, we do clearly see these proposals of economic collaboration between the DRC and Rwanda, not only on minerals, but also on conservation, for instance, but also natural resources, of course. And that would then be as a vehicle for US investment or further US engagement. But this process so far is really opaque, and it doesn't really show. It's not clear how this economic component will feed into the peace process itself, because in its essence, the conflict is not about those resources only. There are a lot of other political factors involved. There are security motivations involved, and so an economic cooperation does not address those causes. So any peace agreement should also look at the security motivations, presence of the FDLR, but also the political context around M23 itself, its local and national demands.
Well, Qatar also tried to broker a deal before. Why did that fail?
There was a surprise meeting in March that happened in Doha between the two presidents, and they both stated their intent that they wanted a ceasefire, but it was not really a ceasefire declaration as such. And one of the key problems of the installing of ceasefires or a truce in the conflict has been to get all the stakeholders involved. And so a bilateral arrangement for a ceasefire excludes M23 and its political wing. M23 has declared unilateral ceasefires, not involving the DRC government. And so this is a key reason why these kind of declarations often are not followed through on the terrain. But there's also other dynamics involved in Eastern DRC itself. Even if the DRC government would stated its intent to have a ceasefire, the question is in which way are they able to follow through? The DRC has mobilized local armed groups under a broad banner called Wazalendo, which is Swahili for patriots, to fight M23 and to fight foreign aggression. And it does not really control these groups. Some of them have more hostile relations with the government. They have their own dynamics. Many of them are also opposed to these talks and opposed to a negotiated solution. And so we have seen this in the past where ceasefire arrangements were actually violated or put under pressure because of continued skirmishes involving these local armed groups as well as M23 on the terrain. And so it also shows the kind of not complete control that neither the Congolese government but also Rwanda has on dynamics on the ground. Rwanda's support to M23 is, of course, has been documented, is important, has been shown decisive, but it's also not complete. M23 has its own dynamics and has its own interests, and they are not necessarily always the same interest as Rwandan interest, although there is, of course, a convergence.
Well, there's a startup backed by Bill Gates and Jeff Bezos expanding into the DRC, and they're betting on a peace deal to explore, what is it, lithium, copper, and cobalt. So do you think that can only happen, these kind of investments, if there is a peace deal between the DRC and Rwanda and the M23 rebels?
It depends a bit on what kind of minerals we talk about, but also about the trajectory of the conflict itself, because the resurgence of M23 happened end of 2021, and for a long time remained limited to North Kivu, which is the province where Goma is the provincial capital of, bordering Rwanda and Uganda. And where it was based, it did not really threaten these mining interests directly. It only took its first control over a mining site was in April 2024, when it took control over the coltan mining site of Rubaya in Masisi, which is a major mine for coltan production, from which tantalum can be derived. And so, but also already before, from this mine, minerals were smuggled to Rwanda. So it just did not really was not really a major change in how these value chains operate. But since January, we have seen this drastic escalation of the conflict, with this M23 expansion taking over cities, Goma and Bukavu, and stating its intent to progress further. And so a further southward progression into South Kivu is happening. It has slowed down a lot, but if they would further progress to Tanganyika province, then they could reach these areas where lithium mines are located. The Manono mining site, for example, where these U.S. interests are focused on. If we look at cobalt and copper, those are located mostly in the Copper Belt region in Katanga, where M23 is not directly present. But there are also political dynamics involved around the conflict, Katanga being the province where opposition is strongest. We have Moise Katumbi, main opposition leader, who is in Katanga, a very strong person in Katanga. We have, of course, former President Joseph Kabila, who is in Katanga. And so a real escalation of the conflict where that would involve Katanga would also harm these more industrial, large-scale mining interests, and possibly these infrastructure projects that also the US supports, as the Lobito corridor. But so that's only in the case of a real escalation of that conflict. So at this point, we're not really seeing that happening. We're seeing more kind of freezing of the conflict, apart from some such situations. But in case of a further escalation, that could be the case, yes.
So there's a lot of stumbling blocks, that need to be overcome before there is actually a peace deal. And this is a war that's been going on for years in various elements. Are you confident that real progress can be made?
I'm not confident. No, I'm not confident on this. Although I do consider it a positive development that there is a dialogue process between M23 and the Congolese government, and that there is a direct engagement between Rwanda and the DRC. I think those are positive signals that we haven't seen for the past months. And so there is no military solution to this conflict. And so only a politically negotiated solution is available. And so if those diplomatic processes pop up, I think it is a positive sign. But there's still a lot of questions that remain. Also the U.S. motivations, if an economic arrangement is actually the right avenue towards peace, because it also ties in the conflict to other economic interests, into the geopolitical sphere, which could complicate actually further peace negotiations, bringing further actors on the table and bringing other interests into a dialogue process. And so it could also complicate it further. I do think that as we have seen, because it's not the first time that Rwanda supports these rebellions in Eastern DRC, and many of those in the past have been resolved by some sort of bilateral arrangement between Kinshasa and Kigali that often focused on the question of the FDLR. And so this might be also a possible solution now that these negotiations under US mediation would focus on the question of the FDLR and on possible security cooperation, even to tackle this question. And so I do wonder if that framework will bring, if we are not in a new terrain after the takeover of Goma and Bukavu. But I think that if there would be again this kind of negotiation on this issue, at least it would be positive thing. I think there are two other factors that are complicating at this moment. One is the domestic position of Tshisekedi itself, because he has been really weakened through this conflict. There is opposition calling for him to step down, and also a criticism of these peace negotiations. It was yesterday, I think, when Denis Mukwege, one of the opposition leaders, published a public letter criticizing Tshisekedi for making this deal, which would sell out the country for economic interest and for his own political position. And secondly, there's also the M23 or AFC, the political wing, that also continues to call for regime change. And so that kind of pressure on his position also ties into the negotiations. So because he's in a negotiating table, at the same time, there's also this question of he needs to step down, and so that creates complications, of course, for further diplomatic progress.
Can we just lastly look at the SADC involvement in the conflict there? South African soldiers are now finally, and the other SADC soldiers, withdrawing from the conflict. Was that an utter failure, the involvement of SADC and South Africa in that conflict?
I think yes. There is no other conclusion. I think that if of it being a failure, does not necessarily mean that it is only the responsibility of SADC why it became a failure. There are a lot of factors that tie into this. But yes, it was a failure for several reasons. Already its deployment happened in a moment of ongoing escalation. The regional force of the East African community had withdrawn. Positions were taken over by M23. And so when SADC forces deployed, they could only deploy between Sake and Goma, and not in those other areas where the East African community had deployed. So they already started in very bad circumstances, also being considered as a hostile force by Rwanda, and so not being able to play the same role that the East African Community Force was playing, which was more a buffer zone, more considered as a neutral force, but also difficult cooperation with the Congolese army, and also just the general dynamics on the terrain, which made it very complicated for them to actually carry out its mandate and really protect these areas from further M23 advances. So it has been a failure for several reasons. Also, one of them being the lack of a political process that accompanied the deployment. There was, of course, the Luanda process led by Angola, SADC member state, but those processes were never really very well aligned and harmonized. And so the withdrawal of the Sami DRC is actually also part of the kind of renewed efforts led by the EAC and SADC jointly to create a new peace process. But this has been going very slowly and focused on some technical aspects, but not really having a peace process at the same time. So SADC involvement is now part of these broader EAC SADC efforts, but they go very, very slowly, and they've actually been taken over by Qatar and by the United States. Although there are now efforts to keep kind of advances made in Qatar and in the US, there are efforts to kind of now include those regional actors again. So it was Obasanjo, one of the mediators that were appointed by the process that received a copy of the Declaration of Principles, I think yesterday or 2 days ago, to try to get them involved. There is also Togolese involvement now in the negotiations, but they have been unable to really drive the peace process. And so remains to be seen what role they can play.
And do you think, because in light of this, that SADC should be involved in any other peace processes in Africa?
I think so. I can't speak on other conflict areas or other areas where SADC would negotiate. I'm not gonna speak too much to that. So I would prefer to speak on this specific particular conflict, where I do think that SADC has a role to play because, of course, DRC being a SADC member state already, but also because of stability in the DRC will affect stability in neighboring countries, including SADC countries, and also, of course, there's also the economic interest that go along with it. So it is in SADC's interest to have a regional process on this, and I think they should be part at the table. In what framework that is, that's another discussion, because of course a lot of SADC member states are also member states of the ICGLR, for example, which is another regional organization that has 12 member states, including SADC member states. So there are these different regional organizations that somehow compete and want to play a role in the conflict. So there needs to be an effort to harmonize all of those regional efforts in a coherent process. But I'm sure they will continue to have a role to play.
Bram Verelst from the ISS, thank you so much for speaking to us.
You're welcome.